Welcome to the third episode of the ClassCast podcast. I'm Ryan Tibbens, and today my guest is Jessica Berg.
Hi.
And you are the first teacher guest. So where do you teach?
I teach at Rockridge High School.
Okay, and what do you teach?
I teach AP Language and Women's Studies.
Awesome. And so the Women's Studies thing is actually the reason that I thought that you would be a great person to do this, because one, I don't know you that well, so I have nothing to lean on. You know, other interviews have been former students. I've got nothing here. But you're also doing something new in the county. How long have you been thinking about creating that class?
It was something I always tried to incorporate aspects of in English through whatever I've been teaching book reading-wise. And then, like so many people, it was the 2016 elections that was kind of that real catalyst and push that something needs to change. It needs to be more than just sporadic elements incorporated in my regular English classroom. So that's when I really started pushing for an actual course.
Okay. Did, almost beta testing, did you do some or all of your women's studies materials in the AP Lang class?
No.
First, or this is just creating as you go?
Creating as I go. And that was pretty much all of last summer, was writing the curriculum and lesson plans and pretty much from the ground up because, I took these courses in college, but that just doesn't really transfer to a high school classroom. I can't lecture for an hour and then be like, go read this material.
Yeah, I mean, you can, but it takes a select crowd of students or a forgiving principal.
Right, exactly. And I really found through teaching the course, it was so much of me backfilling knowledge that just is not covered. Some things I thought should have been a given and understanding, what the Equal Rights Amendment is or what Title IX covers, and students did not know that. Right. So I really had to... But in 2016, because we were already in the middle of a school year, I started a group at Rockridge. Our mascot's the Phoenix, and I called it Ms. Phoenix, just for young women to come and talk about these issues. So that's where I really kind of forayed that and those conversations with students.
Okay. How much influence did those students have in what you've done?
Oh my gosh, they are the reason. Just because I saw an interest. It's one thing for me to have this idea and this want to teach it, or there's students that are going to take it and be interested in it, and this passion and really this need for it. That, these are young women, junior, seniors in high school, getting ready to go out into the real world and not knowing certain things, and me as a teacher, as a woman, as a mother, feeling a responsibility to give them that. So, they are the reason. They are absolutely
Were
the
there,
reason.
Not that I would expect many, if any, were there any males in the group?
Yes, and I had 2 gentlemen take it this year, and I think in terms of scheduling, 5 next year. Yeah.
That's, it's like 2 sides of the same coin, that teaching a class like this provides all kinds of great awareness, culturally and personally and the rest. And so in a way, I would think in general it's probably more valuable to empower young women, but probably a lot of guys should be hearing some of this too. And so that was, how many kids would sign up for the elective and do that.
Right.
So all right, so background, and I don't remember if I mentioned this to you or not, but you did the professional development session last spring, winter, or something?
April, and I did a similar one in the pre-school year.
Okay, yeah. Sessions, so I went to the one in the spring, and I was the only dude in the room.
Yeah.
Which I didn't actually expect. I didn't expect many, but I looked in and I was like, all right, that's fine. I mean, I'm here to listen. And I thought it was funny because I really went in looking for essentially a reading list. I don't plan on teaching the course. I'm ill-qualified in a lot of ways, and I got a lot of good, essays and things that I'm going to try to work into my other classes. But I thought the way the discussion went was interesting, and there were maybe 2 times where you said something or someone in the room, another teacher makes a comment, and then there's this very slight pause, and I can feel eyes dart over at me. I'm I'm good. You say whatever, And so thinking about as the only, say, male teacher that showed up, did you have any guys at the other one that you'd done?
Yes, but he is a coworker of mine,
Okay.
Paul Koch, and he's phenomenal and very encouraging, and so he used to me and that type of discussion.
Yeah. So I thought it was great, and this is, I don't know if this is a good thing or this might be. I certainly don't want to take anything away from the rest of the presentation, but aside from a reading list, the thing that struck me the most was like a little thought experiment that you shared. And we'll talk about this later, but I've been doing a lot of this in class, like a lot of thought experiments and philosophy stuff. But when you said sort of imagine, what would you do, how would the world be if, as a woman, all men disappeared for, I forget, it was like a week or 4 days or something like that. It's like assume that your gas stations and hospitals keep running, but that otherwise just men disappear. And I thought about it. I was like, yeah, if all women disappeared, and that was your joke. And this is where we'll stray into like, is that classroom appropriate? But it was, what would men do if women disappeared? And it was like there was this slight pause, and everyone looked at me, and you're like, they'd probably just like jerk off. And I was like, yeah. I thought about it. I was like, that's probably it. There'd probably be more fist fights too. I think there's a lot of times like guys would like have fun, just fight, and you don't because it would upset a woman around you. And I was like, it would probably just be a lot of fist fights and masturbation. Nothing else would change. But on the reverse of it, and I mean, what's your answer to it? Like, if all men disappeared, because women in the room had a lot of stuff that I never even crossed my mind.
Right.
But like, if all men disappeared,
my biggest one is just being able to go for a run, like around my own neighborhood when it's dark outside. And, I still carry mace to do that. And it's still one of those things, it's that constant alertness that it just becomes a second nature as a woman, like parking garages. I try to avoid them at all costs.
Right.
And so just little things like that. And that's...
Yeah, and that's that subtle sort of thing. And I thought it was a really good, like, I'm going to actually use that in my classes this year, just as a demonstration, because you can even take it outside of sex or gender, and you can. I was thinking about it afterwards. I'm like, you could even do that, like with a race issue. Mm-hmm. If all white people disappeared, what would be different for black people in this country? And like, man, and as a middle class white male, like, I very rarely have to question this, And so that was the thing, though, that really got me thinking, like, this is really a conversation worth having in the classroom. Do you present that to kids in class?
Yes, and I had actually heard that thought experiment a little later on in the class. The one that is often presented is, and this would be more applicable or a more high school friendly topic, if you ask, like, on a daily basis, what do you do to protect yourself? And so, women list these things they're always taught, like park in well-lit areas, carry your keys between your knuckles, don't go to the bathroom alone. People are always asking, like, why do you go to the bathroom in groups? Because it's safe. And most young men, and this is done in a lot of college courses, are like, I don't do anything, really at the forefront of my mind. And so that kind of starts that conversation.
Do you think that that's... I mean, obviously a lot of that's taught, but do you think any part of that is, I don't know if I want to use the word natural, like building, like, has some of that just evolved, do you think? Like,
meaning?
Well, like, I don't know. When I was young, like, my dad taught me early on, and my dad's a great guy, but especially when he was young, he had a very bad temper. Like, he got in a lot of fights. And when I was little, like elementary school, middle school, like, I got in a lot of fights. I don't know why. People would say something and you hit them. Like, I don't know. And over time, I'm like, okay, calm down. Like, that's not necessary. But from an early age, anytime, and I probably still do it subconsciously, but I used to do it and think about it. I'd walk into a room of, like, if there's guys I don't know, my first thought is I look around the room, and it's two things, like, who looks friendly, and which guys in this room could I not beat in a fight? And so I don't know that everyone does that consciously, but I've had a similar conversation with male students who are like, yeah, I guess I do kind of think that. Like
sizing one another
yeah, up. And it's not that... And I mean, even like very non-aggressive students have said, yeah, I guess I kind of think about it. Is that a thing you think is taught? Like, are young men just automatically just thinking about it so they don't think about protecting themselves because that's already there? Or like, do women think that? Do you look at another woman like, could I take her? Like,
no, and I think that's interesting because I think that male aspect of sizing one another up comes from a different perspective where it's like, not to go with like the stereotypical like alpha male type of thing, but I think a lot of it's so much instinctual, whereas like a woman's this kind of self-preservation on the other side.
Yeah, and that's I guess what I'm thinking is like how much of that is just a part of sort of the psychology that has evolved either biologically or culturally or whatever.
Right.
That's just how you start to think, versus how much of that is, imprinted on us. So are women cautious just because they're cautious, or are women cautious because they're taught to be cautious? I mean, and obviously the point here is that no one should have to be taught, right?
No, but it's interesting because it's, I always use the phrase so much in class, like at the end of the day, where animals, our base instinct is survival. And so I think some of it is biological, like evolutionary, and then I think the nuances of it today are cultural,
right? Right. Yeah, I just, I thought like, wow, and I actually, I floated that a couple days ago, after I'd emailed you, I was talking to a friend, and I was just like, I just wondered. And I said, what would you do if all women disappeared? And he's like, I don't know, whatever. And he's like, I'd eat Cheetos in my underwear because my wife wouldn't yell at me or something. Like, it was something stupid. And I was like, and I explained like how different that answer probably would be for a woman. He's like, I don't know. And it's like he started to disagree, and there was a pause. And I guess I see your point. And I thought, that right there, like that alone is a good enough reason to think more carefully about gender roles and I don't know. I just thought that was really cool. And that was, again, not to take anything away from the rest of the whole discussion was good, but that was the thing that like really stuck with me, because then for the next like 3 days after that professional development, I just kept thinking about that and then substituting different groups of people. If this group of people disappeared, and I thought like, I don't know. How much of the class, say thinking about that, how you said, the nuance of some of these issues, say now in our culture at this time, how much of the class deals with very current issues and texts compared to like how much modern stuff you're doing compared to reading Elizabeth Cady Stanton? Like, what's the balance?
So when I started writing it, my just starting point was the 19th Amendment, and I kind of framing this question: why did women even have to fight for the right to vote? Why was that not a given? And so then I kept going back to like, how did this rise of the patriarchy really happen when you look at prehistory and stuff in more egalitarian societies, and women were goddesses and stuff. And so then me being me, that's where I started. And so I had this whole course outline up to, first, second, third, fourth wave feminism into the future. Right. And inevitably I would come into a class like, here's what we're going to cover today. And, this past year alone was just like, boom, boom, boom. Okay, scrap that. Let's talk about what's going on in our real world. And like one whole day, actually probably for a whole week, we watched the Brett Kavanaugh hearings.
Okay.
And they kept hearing the name Anita Hill, and I was going to discuss her, in third wave feminism and show them the documentary and that picture of, all the white old men and Joe Biden sitting there. Right. And so then I just moved that here, like, here's who she is, this is why it's, So it was a constant.
And especially teaching a thing for the first time. Yeah. And it's nice because, as an elective, like, you have AP Lang, right? So you have the AP exam and you have SOLs. All I teach is 11th grade. All I've taught for years is 11th grade. They just thrown me public speaking. So now, but otherwise, every class I teach has tests that, like, matter. And so sometimes when I want to, like, flip-flop a thing, or we're just going to toss in, I'm always thinking not, like, is that interesting, useful? Yeah. Is that necessary given the amount of time I have for these other things? And so to have an elective that you're passionate about.
And I'll say it took me like a good quarter and a half to undo that thinking, like, it's okay if like we get really going on a discussion if they're interested, because there is no exam. Yeah. This is just, so it was definitely freeing, and I had to like, get out of my AP SOL mindset.
Yeah, and so like for kids who are in the class and they're interested but maybe don't have the background knowledge, this is something I don't know where the guy teaches, but I read this article a few years ago, and I think it's awesome. He's a history teacher. He teaches U.S. history somewhere, and he decided that the way we do it is all wrong because you spend all this time on the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. I'm like, how much do you really need to know about the War of 1812? Like, almost nothing. Unless you're literally going to be a history teacher, like, nothing. You could be a politician, and it's essentially useless. Not that no one should know it, just not everyone needs to know it, right? I mean, you could be president on a lot of things, as it turns out, but so what he did was he flipped it, and so he starts with today, and he teaches history in reverse. So here's what's going on, what led to it. And he goes back, and that way kids get all of this information about what's going on in Afghanistan or Iraq, or they get this great, time on the Vietnam War. And then when you get close to the end of the year, you're close to test time, and you start to scramble, instead of scrambling through the current stuff that really matters more to the kids, he's scrambling through the old stuff that maybe they need for the test, but doesn't influence their daily lives as much. Like, is that kind of almost how you feel like, I mean, not that you've actually arranged the class that way, but does it almost make more sense for engagement to get the kids the modern thing and then teach them the context and the background?
Yeah. And that was the one thing, actually getting to teach the material, realizing that. And so then I slowly started to structure each class block a little differently, where, yes, we'd be talking about, first wave feminism or the suffragettes, but always bringing in that this is why it matters today. The Equal Rights Amendment that was introduced shortly after the passage of the 19th Amendment is still not ratified today. Yeah. This is why it matters. And so then I took it as more of that, like...
Do you ever, when you bring that up, just because that actually comes up in my class sometimes, do you ever have students who push back, or not push back, but students who say, like, yeah, I get it? Because this is usually how it goes in my class. People say, I get it. It's not that it's a bad idea, but, and they give the but, and male and female students will do this. Probably more males, but I've had plenty of female students make this argument that most of those rights and all this sort of stuff is already there in other forms. And so they make the argument, like my assignment is they give an elevator pitch, like a 2 to 3 minute speech for the 28th Amendment. Anything you want, just what's something your government should or shouldn't do that we don't talk about well, and get your classmates to support the idea. You got 2 minutes, get up and do it. And several students have done the Equal Rights Amendment. And then the argument is, it's not that I disagree, but if we're going to go through all the work of making amendments, there's like other things that would be more important that we haven't done. Like, do you have students in the women's studies class push back?
Not really push back against that. I think the part, again, me backfilling the information is why it needs to be done. That essentially all of these progressive laws, be they state laws, federal laws, are kind of standing on a foundation of sand unless there's a constitutional backing that you can't discriminate based on gender. Because some people point to Title VII, I might be completely getting this wrong, but like in the Civil Rights Act, that it was kind of like thrown in there at the end.
Right.
And it's like... No, because you just need this backing, like the whole Roe v. Wade settled law.
Like, you put it in the Constitution, and then you don't really get to negotiate it too much. That's actually when students do the speeches, the ones that I tend to like the most, even sometimes I disagree with how they do it, but is to make a constitutional right to access to education or to health care. Mm-hmm. And then, however it would be implemented, like I always tell them, like, you have 2 minutes. You don't have to go into how you implement it. Like, that's someone else's job to figure out, to legislate it, to create a bureaucracy for it, whatever it is. You're just saying that the government will do or won't do this thing. And so for the Equal Rights Amendment, you say, well, that's kind of there in all these other places, but man, you shouldn't have to do the research. Like, you should just be able to say all people have, these rights or this treatment. Can I put you on the spot?
Yeah.
And if you don't,
If I don't know that.
So, and I'm asking you because I was about to explain it, and I realize you probably know this much better than me. What is the Equal Rights Amendment for anyone who maybe is listening and doesn't know?
Yeah, so the Equal Rights Amendment was actually introduced by Alice Paul, 1921, like I said, shortly after the 19th. And it's just that, and I don't think the wording has changed one single bit since she introduced it, that you can't discriminate based on gender, equality of the sexes.
Do you think it's... Yeah, I mean, and I don't know this, and that was a much better job than I would have done anyway. Do you think, or do you know if it has been updated to include issues of, like, sexual preference or orientation or anything like that?
It hasn't. Not in terms of, like, the actual wording of what the amendment would be.
Right.
But there has been talk of that, like, would that cover... things like the bathroom bill and stuff
Right.
like that. And yeah, I think it would definitely give a framework for legislation for rights to the LGBTQIA community to be more easily solidified into law, because it's just, you can't discriminate based on sex, and then how you
However,
choose
right,
to
right, and
interpret
that's
that.
it's it's one of those things that you do like the broad strokes first
Right.
and work out the details later. And I also think both from class discussions and really, I mean, just paying attention to what's actually going on in government, I think that one of the easiest things that people get stuck on, and sometimes do on purpose, is you reject the broad idea based on the details,
Yeah.
knowing full well that you have to establish the broader idea for make the amendment and then figure out details of implementation.
Mm-hmm.
And people sometimes do a really good job of saying, well, what about this in the implementation piece? And that way you're in this great position where I don't have to argue against equal rights for people, because that makes me sound awful, but I can make sure this doesn't go anywhere by arguing about this detail later on. And I know students do it in class, and if kids are smart enough to do it in class, I would like to believe elected officials are doing the same thing. And I know sometimes you hear it.
Phyllis Schlafly in the second wave of feminism in the 60s, 70s, which were really so many gains, in that era, and really, really pushing for the ERA. She was the one kind of spearheading this movement of, and so many people were thinking, well, if the equal rights pass, then women will be drafted. And that's one of those details.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like, or that abortion would just be rampant, that this just gives a free-for-all. And it's like, those, again, these details.
You
that
can still make some decisions on top of, I mean, and for example, in that, this isn't where I want the conversation to go, but just as a parallel, like, you have the Second Amendment right to bear arms, and you can defend that as many ways as you want, but there are still all kinds of laws that limit it.
Right.
And it's like, there are all kinds of things that do, like, I have a couple of friends, I have a couple of former students who will listen to this who are like huge gun fanatics and like regularly post things that say like, any regulation is infringement. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, if you want to be real hardcore about it, I see your point. That being said, there's probably like some reasonable little things you can do. And so in that case, we still have that argument all the time. You have free speech, but,
Right.
And then there's still some limitations on it. So there's no reason to think you couldn't pass an equal rights amendment and still have certain exceptions or caveats, because we do it with all the other ones.
Yeah.
I don't know. What would happen? Like, if they passed it?
Well, so it's really, I don't know how much you're following, but Virginia is in the spotlight right now because we could be the 38th state to actually ratify it. And then there's been this massive push in the past few years, especially since Illinois and Nevada did. And so you need that 38th state to then, put it on the floor of the House. And so this recent vote in January, February, the Virginia House didn't even let it get out of committee. And the proponents of the ERA in Virginia, Delegate Carol Foy, she's amazing, just a phenomenal woman who's been massive in this push for it. We had the votes if it had gotten out of committee.
Right.
And so then now this whole thing again is it'll be up in January 2020 for another vote, because this could be it. And then
Right.
it's undoing the timeline that are on amendments, like you have to ratify this by X number of years or whatever it is.
I don't remember, 5 years or something.
Right, but there's been previous amendments that have, far surpassed that time frame that have been, put
Right.
into law. So then it would really just give a solid groundwork to so many progressive pieces of legislation, be it like the Lilly Ledbetter Act or things like that. That settles it, that this is constitutionally backed, so that if it ever gets brought up in a court and up to the Supreme Court, that's their
Yeah. I mean, they have something to rule
Right.
on or rule from. So you said you brought up the Lilly Ledbetter stuff. So we work we're government employees, right? And so our pay scale is public, and the only way we get a raise is by not getting fired, which I have many concerns about. Like, the only monetary incentive we have is be good enough not to get fired.
Yeah.
Like, there's no incentive to be great unless it's internal, But say in private enterprise, depending on the data you look at, and most of the data shows that there's some pay gap. But I've also read, and I believe that there is, but I've read plenty that points out that depending on the industry you're looking in, like sometimes there's a reasonable explanation for it. And so I look at it, and again, as a male, my approach is probably different. I think that the idea of paying people differently, especially is wrong generally, especially if the number one issue is the person's gender, right? Do you think that's a thing you could actually fix? Because in some cases it's obvious and it's abusive and whatever.
Right.
And in some cases it's like a built-in piece where if you take maternity leave and you're missing this work time or you're losing out on experience or these sorts of things, like there are situations where I understand why the gap is there. I don't think it's good, but I also don't know if there's an easy solution to it. Like, should the government be telling a private company how much to pay their people? Do you think do you think it would work? I guess. I don't know. What do you like? I like the idea. It's where I get stuck in the details. I like the broad strokes, and I really have no idea how you'd enforce something like that.
Yeah. And it is, because I actually dug into it, and so when you see the different facts and figures, like 78 cents on the dollar, less for women of color, it actually isn't like a straight up and down what you're given at the end of the week in your paycheck. Those figures factor in things like women who have to take paid leave if they have children or miss out on time, therefore missing out on a promotion. So
we're averaging like bigger chunks of time,
which
maybe?
I didn't necessarily know. So I think those things would be really hard to legislate, but I think the biggest thing is you look at something right now like the U.S. women's national soccer team, and if you're looking at dollars for advertising and viewership versus the men, like how can you not? And so it's one of those things and none of this stuff is easy. Nothing that ever has happened in terms of civil rights or progress has been. Right. But that shouldn't stop us from trying. Decide
on the value first. It's we do this a lot in class, ethics versus morals. Or your ethic is sort of the social value, the cultural value. We all agree or mostly agree on this, and then morals are individually what you think. And your morals may not match the society's ethics and all that. But it's like we could probably agree that people should be paid and treated equally, fairly, all the rest. And then you got to work on the details, which is where it would get hard. All right, so for the women's soccer, since you brought it up, I haven't written anything for the website in a couple of weeks. I've been putting a lot of time into doing these recordings and figuring all this stuff out. But the last thing I did, and I ended up not posting it because I didn't know how to finish it, was looking at the pay issues. And I have no idea what to do because in the United States, especially in years like just last year or whatever, when the men's team doesn't even make it to the World Cup, like you don't even make it into the final tournament, the women should be making a lot more money, right? But then when you look at it like from FIFA's perspective, or when you do like the international thing, most countries' women's teams don't attract that viewership. And so like I started off like writing this thing and like linking articles, and I'm like, pay them. And then the more I looked at it, I'm like, pay them, but because like the money isn't really there, and so like I got so turned around on it, like my mind changed 10 different times that I have an article saved with like all this research linked in, and there's just nothing at the end because I'm like, I have no idea, like why should they be paid more?
So same thing
or any
with
part
me.
of the crap I just spewed.
Right. And like reading articles, like you just get so much more information, then you just start to question. But there's this great interview with Megan Rapinoe on Pod Save America after they won, and where she talks about it. And the lawsuit that's currently ongoing isn't against FIFA, it's against
U.S. Soccer.
U.S. Soccer Federation. And, when they talk about that paying, a lot of it is like advertising dollars and viewership and jersey sales, which the women are just like exceedingly more than men in that revenue. And it is. I don't have the answer, but she had a lot of great information being at the center of it.
And in that regard, like, what would probably make the most sense, and maybe it wouldn't, but I think what would make the most sense, where you sort of make all sides a little happy. Like, I say this all the time, that we've gotten very bad at compromising, like, as a culture, and it's because we think that compromise is supposed to make everyone happy, and I personally think that compromise is about making everyone equally unhappy, but with an end result that's a little bit better than you have now.
Right.
In the end, we're at least a little bit better off than we are now, and everybody has approximately equal things to complain about. Like, don't think about how happy you'll be. Is it better, And so, but a compromise would just be like, pick a percentage. Players, men, women, whatever, take in X percent of all the revenue, jersey sales, advertising, television contracts, whatever. And then that way, if women have better viewership, or they get that money. If men have it, they get the money. But then you don't necessarily have to argue it. You just say, here's the number, and get good and popular. And I'm sure that's not a perfect solution, but I think it makes everyone equally unhappy.
And there was the one fact I didn't know. There was this funny interview with Hasan Minhaj and some of the women's soccer players, and that the men get paid if they lose. The women do not.
Yeah. And if you look at the figures,
right. So that's like
Yeah, maybe when I post this, I can I won't use my trash article that I can't figure out, but I can there's some sources that I have that show the direct pay comparison, and it's insane. Mm-hmm. Some of them you can't explain with international money and the rest, and some of them just you can't really. Mm-hmm. And those are the places where you really have to do something, because if you can't explain the disparity, then there shouldn't be one. Or if you have to work too hard to explain it, then that shouldn't be there. There are some cases, again, where you start looking at the international money. I understand how that can play out differently. All right, so I'm gonna just one more thing on that, because this is really where I got stuck. I've been doing a lot of this in my AP classes, is teaching kids not to accept premises. Just don't accept the premise of someone else's argument, because you end up arguing these details, and maybe you disagree with the broader thing. And so the question is, should men and women be paid equally for soccer? Yes or no? But then you say, well, why would they be paid differently? Well, they're playing different games. Should we divide men and women's sports? So should they be playing separately at all?
This is a really interesting topic, and one my husband and I have been recently talking about. So last year I went to South Africa. I got to chaperone 8 students for this Girls Leadership Summit.
Awesome.
And it was all these amazing speakers, and one was a sports psychologist, and she was talking about Caster Semenya, who's a South African runner. And so and in her discussion, it brought up so many questions, because it's what is the premise, and dividing things based on sex and gender. And so, I said to my husband, we cannot deny that there are differences biologically between men and women.
Yeah, there are huge differences, especially in the average. I mean, there's always overlap, and that's the question.
There's a sliding spectrum.
There are some women that absolutely could compete with the men. Mm-hmm. The question is it enough to make that actual fair access to play a game in the rest? And that's actually the Caster Semenya dispute. I wrote a short thing about right after the court ruled, and then realized that most major news organizations were not fully reporting the situation. They didn't actually address her biology,
right?
Which does change. At first I thought, what an outrage! How can they tell her she can't compete as a woman and do all the rest? And then, biologically, she really is intersex. If you just did a blood test, you would think that's a man, right? And so that's a very tricky and very specific situation. Mm-hmm. I think the conversation, everyone took it to this broad thing, and it's that court ruled on something very specific, and they tried to be as delicate and respectful as they could in it. I read the whole thing, but in that situation, where should she be competing?
Right.
And so, I threw it to students near the end of the school year. I had in my public speaking class, we had some extra time, and there were a few girls who played varsity lacrosse and soccer, and I just said, why do we do it? Why do we separate men's and women's sports? And for some of it's the patriarchy, and in some cases they pointed out little things like, you say, well, men and women can't compete in, say, like the discus or shot put, like track and field, because they're different weight. It's a different weight. But I was like, but we made that rule. Like, it's a sport. You literally make up all the rules.
Right.
You just change the rule and everyone can do it. And one of the girls said, and she's great. I taught her in AP 11th grade and public speaking 12th grade. And she said, she goes, I don't know about the professional stuff. She said, but if you're thinking about youth sports in high school and maybe even through college, she said, if you only had one team, so few young women would make the team that you'd be missing out on all the other things that come with sports. And I was like, yeah, like most of these kids in high school aren't playing professional. Most of them aren't playing in college, But some kids learn more in their after-school activities than they actually do in the classroom, right? And so I would never want to deny that opportunity. And so it makes sense to do that division. When you're a professional and you're being paid, like, should at the international or professional thing, like, should we just throw everyone together? Like, my gut reaction is no, but I don't know why I'm saying that. Like,
and I think it's interesting with the big news cases being like track and field, where you're not physically coming into contact with other
non-contact
player.
sport, yeah.
Right. So, we talked about it. If you go sport by sport, let's say something like football, like American football, which there aren't, as far as I know, maybe besides some like intramural type things, women's football teams.
Yeah, I think they did that in the 70s, actually.
Yeah. Like that comes down to perhaps a safety issue, if you're going up against 300, 400-pound linebackers, like that's a big difference. But in the sports psychologist in South Africa, she was kind of throwing these things out. Like, if you look at something, say, swimming, track and field, those type of sports, like, should you divide it time? Like, if you can run, an under 4-minute mile, you compete, male, female, in this.
So,
like weight classes,
do you
like
golf?
wrestling.
Do you golf?
No.
Okay, I know your husband golfs.
does,
and so I since I've had kids, I don't golf. But when you do like most like club championships, they actually divide it into flights. There's like there's the championship or the players or whatever, and then there's the open division, and then you'll have a junior thing, and then women's, and sometimes for a bigger club they'll even divide the women's into your best players. They do it by handicap, and that way everyone has a level to compete on. But even then, even in golf, where like they still do that division, and so.
And it's interesting you bring that up, because we were just talking. I've learned so much about golf since being married to him, like the different tee boxes and what they would call the ladies' tees. And he was recently playing in a tournament, and there were two young women who were college players in golf, and where men kind of have this stigma about playing at the ladies' tees, but might not necessarily be able to drive and play from the
like
back
you probably
tees.
should be playing from
Right.
that. Yeah.
So he said he was watching this unfold in a tournament where these two college player girls were just like striping it from the back tees and just showing up these two kind of somewhat, middle-aged white men who he was like, their golf, where they were at in their skill, should have been playing from the front tees, but because they're labeled ladies' tees, it's seen as...
and I think it's the USGA has been... I used to work at Algonquin Golf Course, and so I kept up on stuff a little better because I was in the pro shop and I talked with the pro there a lot, but they were actually working to try to change the language, because your red tees up close were women's or ladies, then you have gold, which is seniors, like 55 and up or 60 and up, and then you have like your white tees, sort of regular playing golf, and then you have blues for if you're really good or you hit the ball far, and then usually like black is like your pro, or you're really good, you're a scratch golfer kind of deal. And what they're trying to do is get rid of that and basically set it up by how good are you? Like so if you're not that great, play from the closer one. Right. You're going to play better, you're going to score better, and maybe more importantly for the business side, you'll play faster, which means you don't a round of golf shouldn't take you more than 4 hours, and it always does.
Oh my gosh.
And, that's why I haven't played. I got 2 kids. I'm like, man, I'm lucky if I can get out for an hour, let alone 4. But you make that division. That being said, like in golf, maybe that makes more sense. I don't know if you can like handicap a track meet like that though.
No.
Like can you put everyone on the same track and have the guys start from 30 meters behind? Like, is that a reasonable solution? I don't know.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like I don't know, and who and where and how is this going to start?
Yeah.
To change.
Yeah, and it's in a way it's separate from the other conversation, because when you have a discussion of, say, sports or athletics, you're focusing in that discussion. There's plenty of psychology in sports, but almost all of that discussion focused specifically on biological differences. Mm-hmm. The average stride, like the reason men and women use different height hurdles is the average length of your stride and how high your hips are off the ground on average. And in looking this stuff up, like I don't think it's the record. I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago. They did this study. Somebody did all this research at like Johns Hopkins or Duke or something, where they looked at the best women's time for like the 200 meter or something, and then they compared it to guys. And the fastest American women's time for like that whole year, for the last couple of years, whatever it was, had been beaten like 14,000 times by men, including a lot of kids in high school. You have the fastest woman in the country, and you've got just fast kids, like males in high school being, and you go, all right, the fact, like that's a thing you have to address. Yeah. And if you want people to have access to play and all that, then it makes sense to do some kind of division, whether it's by skill or by sex or whatever it is. That conversation probably doesn't need to factor into the rest of it, though, in terms of a person's access to pay or education or for a job. Like, the athletic piece is interesting. Mm-hmm. Like, it's really fun to talk about. It's hard to think about when you actually look at the data. But that probably has no bearing when it comes to the broader, like, political issue of, right to, say, family leave or fair pay and work. And it's one of those times we put them to, it turns into the same conversation because it turns into the classic boys versus girls. Mm-hmm. But, like, they're not the same thing.
Right.
You said the draft thing.
Yeah.
Do you do that in class? Do you talk with kids in women's studies class about, like, I mean, you point out, like, that's one of the things that people go, like, well, but what if you did this, women would have to be drafted. Do you talk about that in class?
Oh, yeah. And, when I explained what the ERA was, and I actually showed an interview clip where it was Good Morning America or the Today Show, and it was Betty Friedan and Phyllis Schlafly debating the ERA, and so Phyllis brought up the draft, and you can see Betty Friedan, who wrote the Feminist Mystique, rolls her eyes, like her facial expressions were great in it. And it's like, again, I like what you said, like, don't accept someone's premise of their argument, step back and just look at the draft in general.
That's what I was just going to say. Like, people say, like, well, should women be drafted? I'm like, first,
should men?
Should anyone be drafted? And if you can't answer the first question, don't even try to answer the second one. And that's where, like, should men and women be paid the same in soccer? Should they be playing separately? And then you go, well, you can make the argument that I don't love this, but there is some truth in it. If the men are that much better at the sport, whether they're winning or not, if they're just that much better, you can make the argument that based purely on the skill on the field, you've earned some of that money. I don't know that that's fair, especially with advertising stuff. But then you go to, like, the draft issue, it's immediately, well, should women be drafted? And, like, hold up.
Right.
Should anyone?
Yeah.
But, like, what do students say about it?
They were kind of, of that same mindset at first. They're like, not necessarily because I like what the history teacher did, because so many of them don't really know the whole Vietnam and
they don't know any of the things that matter the most.
Like, I've read,
we're not teaching any of that.
Taught
we're not
the
doing
things
well.
They've carried with them, and even I learned a lot while researching that I didn't learn in high school. So when I showed that clip and brought up those debates against the ERA, they were kind of like, for a minute, and then they kind of came to that. Yeah, but, like, how likely is this? And then they would ask that question, how many times has the draft actually happened in the United States history? And so they're really good at that, at, like, pausing, like, okay, that's a good point, but, and then they start to think it out, like, okay, there's something wrong with that.
Yeah, and that's where, like, sort of tying it back into school more, it's something I've done more and more the last few years, is that I mean, don't get me wrong, I want to read good stuff and the rest, but I almost don't care the thing that they're specifically going to read, especially in, like, the academic class. I just need you to think really well. And that's why the name of the website is Read, Think, Write, Speak, because I tell all the classes at the beginning of the year, you have 4 things you have to do to have an effective education. You need to be reading and listening, but then, you know, thinking and writing and speaking. And if you're in math, the writing is doing the math. But, like, that's the whole thing. And it doesn't matter if you're going to read, you know, the 200-year-old classic work of literature or an article that's recent. The fact that you have students in a classroom that are asking the question of, well, how often does the draft occur, and all the rest, like, it's hard to teach someone to think like that.
Right.
You know? And so, like, in the women's studies class specifically, obviously all the skills are built in, right? They're reading, they're discussing, they're arguing, they're taking in all this information. If you had to pick, I'm giving you a false dichotomy now, is the class more focused on knowledge of the content, the culture, the history, or on the skills of arguing it? Like, it's obviously both, but I'm saying, like, in terms of your designer approach, is it more important that they take away this knowledge piece, this awareness piece, or is it really sort of the thinking skill to ask that question in the first, well, should we have a draft? Should women do the draft? Is it you see what I mean? Like,
yeah.
It's hard to separate them, but
I would say this year what I found, and, you know, who knows necessarily what it might be like next year, because I think students have become more aware, more knowledgeable of these things, but they came in, like, knowing the arguments and knowing where they stood on them, knowing that, you know, there's inequality and oppression and a rape culture. They didn't understand the why and how do I better defend my argument. And so that's where I found me backfilling a lot. Like, okay, this is the thing you're debating, you're arguing, you're discussing with someone else. Now let me tell you why this has occurred, why this is happening, why you feel the way you do, and
contextualize all of this.
Right. So it was.
That's your first year teaching the class,
yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing, but a lot of your students in the first year of the class are probably some of the students that were in the Ms. Phoenix Club before, right?
Yeah.
So next year, this coming year, you're probably going to have students who don't have that background or haven't already been in that group or haven't had those connections. Do you think, because this year it's countywide, right? Like,
yeah,
there's a few schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, you're like making it to the big time. How do you think that'll play out where you have just students signing up for it who haven't had that club, haven't had that discussion yet? Like, I don't know. I mean, how do you see that going in a school where you're not the teacher? Like, I always think I'm doing great stuff in class, and I think, like, hand that off to someone. And it's not, in no way am I thinking, like, oh, I'm better at this. I just, like, I don't know that I can hand off the stuff I teach to someone else because they're not going to do what I'm doing.
Right.
And sometimes, like, the discussion's the important part, and I'm at the center of that, at least to start it, you know. And so when you think, how's it going to go for you with a new group of students who don't have some of that background or experience, or how's it going to go in a different school?
Yeah. That's the to be determined. That's the a little bit of me kind of like releasing that child out there into the world. So we had an interest meeting around February for people that would be interested in teaching it, you know, at the high schools around the county, and I'd say 10 or 11 teachers came, you know, from all over, and I think we had like 15, 16 high schools in the county.
16?
Like, yeah.
16, I think we're about to have 17, something like that.
Right, independent. So it was
just keep
a good
counting.
showing. And then the thing, like I said, you can add that interest. The principal would need to sign off on, you know, allocating that staff to teach it, and then you have to have students to sign up.
Right.
So I think the big thing for this first year was students knew me, students had been coming to this Ms. Phoenix, my kind of presence in the school. Like,
Yeah.
some
I mean,
students
like,
come up to me and they're like, "Oh, you're that feminist teacher. Let me ask you about. I was just dress coded and I feel bad." You know,
Yeah.
I got a lot of that.
That's a
throughout the
fun
year.
one.
So me and the two teachers that are definitely teaching it next year, we've been meeting.
What school? I know they floated it at Broad Run where I teach, but I don't know if they're actually doing it.
Not that I'm aware of. Briarwoods and Dominion.
Okay.
And then there was a teacher that was going to teach it at Independence, and she just moved to Potomac Falls.
Right.
And Independence doesn't have a senior class this year. But so we were kind of discussing, like, here baseline readings that no matter what school, what teacher, at least we'll have that foundation.
Right.
And then for me, telling them my experience this year, but I said, part of it is you are that draw. Like, you can't deny that as a teacher. Like, we all might be teaching the same book, but every teacher has their take, their skill set, their ability, their strengths, their weaknesses. So
and if you're smart, you play to your own strengths.
Right. So I kind of was like, listen, take that where you want to do it, and then kind of talking and working with them, we came up with like a culminating idea so that whatever school we're going to end with this, and I hosted this summit at Rockridge last year called like the Rise To Summit. Like, what are you going to rise to do each and every day to kind of change your corner of the world? And it went pretty well, so we're going to do it again next year and next year. And so like with that, we're going to have like a symposium, kind of like the Academies of Science do. Cool. And so, who knows what the students from Briar versus Dominion versus my students will bring to it.
Right.
But that kind of idea, like, bring your own strengths, bring your own.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I think I mentioned to you at the end, right after the end of the school year. They're trying to create new curriculum for all the English stuff, and so I volunteered to do it. In part because I think we need to update some things, and in part because I always feel like in committee people get very ambitious, and like they forget about the entire sort of sales, so to speak, like the marketing of it. And so, I mean, I've done committee where I did vocab committee a few years ago, and they gave 8 people 2 days, and they should have given 2 people 8 days. I did the benchmark committee years ago, and that was just a train wreck. They had middle school teachers in the room trying to do an 11th grade test. And so I was like, I'm going to do this. I haven't done a committee in a while. I'm a little jaded on them because things don't always play out. I was like, I want to be in the room, and a lot of the discussion was trying to rein things in just a little bit. Not that everyone has to do the same thing, but like we don't even have like one book in a lot of cases that every school is going to do, or we don't have the same number of readings. And from the administrative standpoint, that's a concern. Mm-hmm. They need to have some idea of what's going on. I understand that. But you go too far and all of a sudden everyone has to do the same thing, and no one plays to their strengths, and now you've essentially handcuffed your teachers. Your sales staff no longer knows or believes in what they're doing. But in that meeting, your name came up somehow, and a couple of teachers said great things about you, and that's one of the things that got me thinking about like, oh, hey. But a big part of that discussion was, how do you create a curriculum and like sample units that are focused enough that it starts to get people on the same page more, and maybe even, obviously we want that, but also gives very much like a strong public impression that that's happening a lot, without actually making the changes. Like, you just wrote a curriculum. Like, how did you, I mean, I know you said you picked a couple of core texts, but like, what was your thinking as you were working on it? Like, how do you walk that line when you know you're going to have to release the baby out? And, hey, like, let's see how this is going to go with other teachers and the rest. Like, did you have like a guiding principle or a rule or an idea of like how specific you wanted to be or needed to be versus giving teachers the choice?
I would say a little bit of both. In writing it, I try to be very specific in my language and like the big questions to have students think about, and then as teaching it, as I'm sure they'll find this year, some of that change depending on, a lot of it's your student population. You know, teaching a course at Rockridge, even if it's English, would be very different than Dominion, Parkview, Loudon Valley, just because of the makeup of students.
Got to know your audience.
Right. And so I think that became part of it, where me just being me, super nerd academic, and I always do these deep dives into things, I realized, okay, the feminist theory, they're not ready for this. Let me just back off a little bit on that. And so I think it's kind of nice when I saw the 10, 11 teachers that came to the February meeting. I was like, oh my gosh, I could be in 10, 11 high schools. Like, that's way far exceeded what I thought was going to happen the second year. Now I'm kind of glad it's only 2 because, handing them my curriculum and talking them through it, can they understand and convey just kind of those bigger premises? And it was really a matter of me sitting back and like, what do I want students to know?
Right.
And I think the biggest thing, and I even do this in AP Lang, my always kind of cornerstone is question everything. Like why?
Right.
We just follow along so much with the status quo. And even in education, you brought this up earlier, that's kind of what started me a little bit, was looking at the English curriculum. And it was one year, even before the women's studies, it was kind of in my head. I was getting ready to teach Gatsby. And I'm like sitting up the night before, and I've taught this book so many times. I'm like, okay, I know it's always a struggle getting them through that first chapter, and like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to sell this? Yeah. And then I thought, why am I teaching this? Yeah. And so I started to kind of unravel and unfold, and thinking about myself in high school. I'm a huge reader. I carry a book with me everywhere I go. And there were books I was assigned, like Catcher in the Rye. Yeah. I hated that book. Yeah. I was never assigned the bell jar.
We'll get into it later. Yeah.
And so I was like, and we know as English teachers, if we throw a whole class text like that out, you're going to have your 5, 6 that read it cover to cover, and they lead the class discussion. Right. You're going to have your middle percentage that will skim.
They read it or parts of it.
Spark notes, ask their friend. And then you're going to have like the 5, 6 that don't even open the front cover.
Don't touch it,
And so it's like, so who am I trying to reach here? And so I honestly, and this was the luxury of teaching AP Lang, where as long as I'm getting them that writing focus and understanding that, I was like, I literally walked in the next day and I was like, that's it. Like, from here on, it's choice. As long as you're reading something, I don't care what you're reading. And so I've played with that each year because it is the hard thing to hold them then accountable and to be able to have those discussions. But I've found it so much more.
You can't get better at reading if you're not reading.
Right.
I try to give more choice, and then I feel like the thing that I get the best feedback on, or that talking to students like after they've graduated, the things that they remember most about class are class discussions. Yes. And like the people in the room and the things that are said. And so that means that the book can be secondary, but that also means that if we're not all reading, if not exactly the same book, at least like a small selection of books that are similar, then that whole class discussion can't be done, and it's all small group. And that's good. There is a time and a place, and you need to do that. But the things that kids seem to remember, I do an evaluation form, like anonymous at the end of the year. I have all the kids give me anonymous feedback, what's good, what's bad, what would you change, like all this stuff. And the things that they always seem to gravitate towards were things that were done as whole class discussion. Yeah. And maybe that's a bad thing. I don't know. Depending on who you ask, they'd say, well, these kids need to be working independently, or we need a product that we're going to send out to the community or some other thing. I'm like, maybe we could just read the book and talk about it and then do some writing, how do you choose that to get them to do the reading or do the rest? And so you're thinking about designing, not even just like your own class, your plans for the next marking period or whatever, like think about how you design the entire class for another teacher who then has to still do that adjustment for,
Well, and with that...
You're ambitious.
Well, and that's how kind of each year I've kind of tweaked it in little things.
Can you, sorry to interrupt, but can you keep updating? Like after teachers, 2 other schools do it this year?
Yeah.
Do you expect that there would be an update to the curriculum or revision at the end of this year, next year?
Even since last year, that's what I've kind of been doing this summer, is going back and, looking at, okay, this really worked. I can pull back on this, add more of this, spend more time on this piece because they were interested. So I definitely, and like you said, like as current events unfold, there's a whole new element of things to talk about. And I think with the pieces we chose or are currently like choosing and deciding on for women's studies, and what I did with AP Lang, I read in, I think it was Penny Kittle, and she posed this question, like, if we think it's important, like reading, why aren't we doing it in class? Like, why do we assign it for homework, knowing that
Because it's the flipped classroom.
Right. Oh, yeah, I know.
Right.
And so that kind of made me think, and I was like, okay. And so again, this worked well with AP Lang, the population of students, and the things I need to teach them with pieces of reading. To get that whole class discussion, we'd read those smaller essays, speeches, articles in class. So you'd all have this framework, and then the book reading, the bigger novel or nonfiction piece, that was just kind of like independent reading, but I would always set aside that time. And so we still had that discussion, and I knew everyone was reading,
I can see you doing it.
Right, yeah.
That's why I have them do all their writing in class, because now, one, I know it's done, and two, I know you didn't cheat.
Right.
But then I always think, like, if I do the same thing with the reading, then, like, that's literally all we do is we do the reading, we do the writing, and all of the other stuff goes. And, it stresses me out so much trying to strike this balance.
Yeah.
And so, and obviously, like, as the teacher in the classroom, you make the adjustments to the plans or how much time you spend on a thing. Creating, like, the larger curriculum, you make updates too, but it's always tricky because you're going to make, say, adjustments at that more global level, knowing full well that the individual classroom teachers are going to also be making adjustments at their more local level in the room,
Yeah.
Like I mean, I wouldn't even begin to guess, but, like, think about, it's an interesting class. Like, it's a great idea, and hopefully it goes well in these schools. But, like, think about what it's going to look like in 10 years if it's in all the high schools. Like,
yeah,
you're going to have created a monster, because then you show up and like observe in one class, and you're like, what the hell are you doing? And another one will be like, well, that's better than me. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And, like, there's going to be that variety, and it makes it. I don't know. I just think, like, that's the hardest
horrifying.
part.
Yeah, it is, especially when you pour time and effort and energy, and this is your passion, And so this summer, along with that, I'm trying, or am, writing the book for it. I don't want to necessarily call it a textbook, but just something to kind of give those guidelines. But yeah, I guess that's the big unknown is what is this course going to be going to look like?
Sort of do like the companion text or something.
Yeah.
So we mentioned this right before we started recording, but, like, you're doing that on your own time.
Yeah.
So, like, you're doing a lot of this work to create a class that you care about, that's important, and all the rest. How do you, like, protect your work versus the schoolwork? Like, the curriculum is now the county's,
Yeah.
So the county owns it, and therefore I think the state owns it. Like, I don't know how that goes between counties, but it's like your baby that is sort of someone else's. And I've had this talk with one of the teachers who, my school, who for a long time didn't post, like, any of her stuff on the school website. Like, she'd post an assignment but didn't link anything, didn't attach documents. She said, well, I just don't want to put it out there because I know other people can access it, and that's my stuff. And I have never had the heart to tell her, like, that's not your stuff anymore. Like, by the Virginia Code, as soon as you've used it in the classroom or you made it for the classroom, like, it's theirs. And so the teacher-to-teacher stuff, teachers pay teachers, it's great. Technically speaking, everyone all over the place is just violating copyright law and intellectual property stuff. When you try to create the book, or not try to, when you are creating the book to go with it, or a book that could work with it, maybe that's the language we use to make sure you get to keep it.
Like that.
Create a book that could work with it. Like, how do you distinguish the two? Is that something that you're even worried about? Like,
a little bit, yes. I actually got some great advice from Michelle Picard, our head of English, who we kind of talked about this, because this is all new territory for me, with it. I don't know. And she said, because the book is not necessarily something I'm teaching in the classroom, that if I go to push this into Fairfax, Montgomery County, that's where I can have my, individual intellectual property, because that's not taught in the class. And she said, like, you can reference anecdotally what you do in class.
Yeah.
And to kind of.
But as soon as you, like, bring it into the room, and because I was actually thinking about this last summer, as like I said, I've been trying to write more and do this stuff, and I had this idea about, like, your taking this awesome feminist approach and creating women's studies and all that. I've had a lot of success the last few years doing philosophy and English class. Like, that's where I started on the thought experiment. Like, we do a lot of, we do the trolley problem and ship of Theseus, and I do in the academic classes actually too, and they actually get more into it than anybody. Like, when kids decide that their answer to a thing reflects on them as a person, it's we're not grading an essay right now. We're just talking about it. You're going to write it later. They get really into it.
Yeah.
Like, and that's great. And I thought, we don't do that. And our philosophy class in the county is taught through social studies, which, not that it can't be good, but I think it probably usually isn't, because you're getting the history of philosophy. You're not asking kids to think on their own, at least as much. And so I want to make it an English class. And so I started to do some writing. And I thought, I don't know. So I called LEA. I called our association, not union, and they have an attorney, And so I talked to him on the phone for a half hour, and he basically explained, like, if it's things you're doing in the classroom and using, then technically someone else owns that. He goes, basically no one ever checks it, and so it's one of those things you probably just roll the dice on and assume you're fine. He said, but if it goes in, be careful. He said, if you do it completely separately, it's not specifically for use in your classroom and all the rest, he goes, you're fine. If you write your philosophy of education, you're fine. He said, if you publish the lesson plans you've been using for the last 2 years in your class, that's somebody else's. And he used an example of a teacher in Fairfax, a music teacher, who created this curriculum and this whole, like, I don't know, he described it. It sounded very interesting and elaborate, and then wrote a book. And then said, hey, there's this great book that we should use, and tried to sell it to the county she was teaching in. And when they realized that she's already published this book with this stuff, they actually had an intellectual property dispute. And I don't know, he said in the end the resolution was they split something or something like that. But, like, I think that if you're doing all the work, like, how much do you hand away?
And that's been a big, I've got a lot of different advice, and I've gone through different feelings about it. And it was one of those things, when I looked into it and someone gave me the advice to get it copyrighted, I wrote this whole curriculum last summer when I was not under contract, not at school. It's not a requirement of my profession as an English teacher to do this.
To write the curriculum, right.
Right, and so I got it copyrighted.
Yeah.
And so then it kind of came, once I piloted this and it spread to other schools, well, I have to give them something. And so then now what I've done in working with those teachers this summer, we get paid for it, for the curriculum designing hours. It is the counties. And so I think it'll just kind of be a step by step. How do I feel about this? And then also, like, what is my view of where I want this to go? Right. And I think, as completely naive as it sounds, but especially since having children, and I have 2 little girls, like, I just want to change the world for them.
So
it's like
the class existing is maybe more important than who, say, owns it in a specific sense.
And it's like it is a very hard thing to grapple with, because I've and am still putting so much time and energy and fighting for it, and I am a very type A, person. But then I had to kind of ask myself, okay, what am I really trying to accomplish? And again, as cliche as it sounds, like, education, knowledge is power. Like, I think that's where we need to start to fix any problem, is educate people on it. And so, if it happens and it gets out of my hands, but it's being taught and out there, and more people are knowledgeable of these things. Doing it, yeah. Then at the end of the day,
maybe that's good,
right?
Or at least good enough.
So that's where I'm kind of.
Yeah. Do you think, like, after I had that conversation with the lawyer, and he basically, his thing was like, he goes, if it's not obviously stuff you're doing in the classroom, and you have some sample ideas of what to do, and it's not something that you're already doing a lot of, he goes, you're probably fine. And he said, to be honest, no county in this state, and probably nowhere in the country, do they have the money to pay a person to, like, search through Amazon or Google everything and, like, to look. Like, no one's looking. No one's ever gonna know unless you do the thing where you try to sell it back to them. And he goes. So in that way, he goes, it's probably not an answer you like, but he said, do what you believe in and do what you want to do with it. And in the end, you're either going to hand it off or you're going to do your own thing and just hope nobody bothers you. And
Right.
he goes, and I think in all likelihood no one bothers you. But, you got to decide. And I ended the phone call thinking, like, that is massively discouraging. If we talk about, like, how do you improve schools, which is one of my, like, 3 questions, right? But, like, one of the things that a lot of people say is, you pay teachers or, which is great. And that's part of it. I don't know if that's all of it. But I think a big part of it is, like, professionalism, that it's hard to attract the best people because you don't see any outlets for, like, advancement. Like, like I said, your only raise comes because you didn't get fired, not because you did something great. And so if you know that you can create all this great stuff, but it's not necessarily yours, like, I think that discourages innovation.
Yeah.
And I think in a state where our state legislature is on average fairly conservative, the idea that they would support the county owning what the teachers are doing in the classroom is kind of counterproductive, because these are the same people who would argue that letting small businesses work without regulation and own their stuff and do the thing creates the innovation that's, builds communities and does all this great stuff. And it's like, but apply that back to what's happening in the classroom. Like you should own all of it, and it's not to say that you should be, like, gouging taxpayers on it either, but I feel like it's a discouraging thing when you find teachers who are motivated enough to write a curriculum or to write a book and to do that, and the fact that they even have to question, is this mine or how does this go, I think is a huge problem, because the kind of teachers that we say we want to attract are also the kind of teachers who are going to do what you're doing. And then when you call into question, like, well, what is yours? And, like, man, you're not paying me enough to do the rest of this, so I need to have it in the end. I think giving teachers more rights to their own stuff and more professional trust in what they're doing would be a step. Like, and it doesn't have to be about that. Sorry, I ramble.
No,
but, like, I think, like, it bothers me a lot, because I look at, like, teachers I work with who I think are very good, and I just think, like, you're so limited sometimes by the structure you work in, or by you want to do this innovative thing, but then you don't know what's going to happen afterwards. And that's not helping you attract better people to the profession. So when people say, what would you do to improve school? I've got a million ideas, and one of them is a set of things you could change to attract better talent. And that's not just money. But, like, whether it's money or ownership or anything, like, think outside the box. If you could change school and make it better, you can make the school day longer, make it shorter, go year round, do every day's a field trip, like, anything. Like, what are the things that you would want to do that you think would make school better?
Oh my goodness.
And you can give me one thing, you give me 10. Just as a teacher, what do you see?
I think, kind of like you said, more freedom. And that's precarious, given that you're not going to always have, but like any job, you're not always going to have the best people doing that. So what they choose to do, that freedom might not be beneficiary to students, but you will have teachers who come in and will use that to do amazing things you've never thought of before, to, like, teach history in reverse. Like, that's a little thing, but I think that was probably so beneficial and still is, and that ability to do that. And, like, we can get into the whole...
And how many schools wouldn't allow it?
Right.
How many principals or whoever wouldn't even allow it?
And I think that's where it kind of starts. And, I mean, we've been following this whole system for so long, like this very, what's the analogy, like, kind of...
like industrial school
yes.
system.
There's that, like, drawing video thing that we watched a couple times, and, like, why we get the summers off because of, like, farming. That's like, well, we don't do that anymore. We're not an agrarian society.
So few people do it. That
that's why are then we structuring our school system in Northern Virginia around that, when that's not it anymore.
Year round with bigger breaks would
and there's
brilliant.
I've even read things
probably easy
on we divide class grades by age. Well, not everyone is at the same ability at the same age, mentally, emotionally, and so why is that I wrote a short article for my website about that. It was I forget what it was called, but something about on-time graduation. I just remember sitting in a meeting where, and my principal is awesome. Like,
I'll call him Dave Spage. Call him out by name. Like, he is the number one reason I have a 45-minute commute. I haven't tried to get closer to where I live is because I have a very good situation. And he was talking about, what are we doing to get some kids to graduate and do the rest? And he used the term on-time graduation a few times, and I just thought, like, that's BS. Mm-hmm. Like, that is a stupid idea. And I'm not saying but right. Just the concept, and I know he was relaying something that came from his boss, from that boss, from whatever. If you're serious about kids learning the stuff, and you also know that people learn at different rates, then why is it so important to graduate on your 13th year? Yeah. At the end of when you're 18, like, why can't a kid hang out until they're 20 if they need it?
Right.
And they say, well, we got to do the rest. And this is how they're making a bad argument. The person who's talking on-time graduation is either an idiot or is doing the bidding of an idiot. Mm-hmm. Because if you're serious about just on-time graduation, that we want to get them out as quick as we can, that we've done our jobs, why aren't we pushing for early graduation? We have a ton of kids who graduate when they're 15, 16. Mm-hmm. They have the skills, they have the knowledge, they can pass all the tests.
Oh, yeah.
If you're really serious about moving them through in an efficient way and getting them to a job or to college, there's no discussion of early graduation. Mm-hmm. And we don't like late graduation, which means all we're really doing is stuffing everybody into this one timeline that doesn't make any sense except for setting a budget. It's literally a budget question, and no one ever says that.
And my husband's also a teacher. We talk about a lot of the people putting these policies in place, whether it's the policies for teachers, what we need to be covering, doing, or for students, like you need to pass these SOLs and graduate at this time, aren't actually in the classroom and seeing that day to day. And I even explain this to students with the SOL. In any standardized test, you think of it, how are we measuring knowledge, intelligence, what you've learned? There was a girl, this is years ago, my department chair at Briar Woods would do SOL tutoring, and she was from China, brilliant student, could not pass the reading SOL because of the language barrier.
Yeah.
Nothing more than just silly idioms that, unless you've been an English language speaker for your whole life.
The things you almost don't even teach.
Raining cats and dogs. So it's right. And so I would explain that to them, and it's kind of that step back, and it's like, yeah, if you're seeing that on a question, and English is your second, sometimes with these students, third, fourth language,
right.
And that's how we're measuring your ability to, and it's
how differently you. I had that argument one time, and it never reached any useful conclusion. But I asked, I was like, I understand in English class that you have to take this test in English. Well, you have a lot of kids who struggle through a history SOL, not because they don't learn the stuff, but they don't read well enough in English. Yeah. It's why can't they take the test in Spanish? It's not an English test; it's history. Right. I know, in a practical sense, how much money can we spend to translate a test 50 different times in all these different languages, but realistically, if you just want them to know these things about history, that's separate from your language issue. And so you're not just testing history, which means it's a bad test. Yeah. You're not, if the language is the barrier, unless, I don't like this idea, but again, do the constitutional thing, set a national language. And then you can do it, and it's built on the thing. A lot of states have a state language, and they do it just strictly because they can't afford or don't want to. A lot of times it's financial. They can't afford to release printed transcripts of government proceedings in so many different languages. So a lot of states have an official language so that they can't be sued for not releasing stuff in other places. They're just saving them money. But we don't do that nationally, and as far as I know, we don't have that in school.
And then that gets to that bigger question, and I absolutely love my department at Rockridge. Like you said, you wouldn't commute the 45 minutes if it weren't for Dave Spage. Yeah. I would not have taught this course, be teaching this course without the support of my department. And even with just English, we sit back as a department, what do we want an English student graduating Rockridge High School to know? And so when we get told they have to take these standardized tests by the state or Common Core and other places in the country, it's what are we really measuring? What do we want a student that goes through this public system to be able to do, to know,
Yeah.
is, like you said, the War of 1812, is that
Does
going to
that
be that valuable
matter?
linchpin piece of
Yeah.
knowledge that's going to,
Yeah. Like it matters, just doesn't matter
right. And it's
to
like
that many people in that detail.
you need to have a foundation and some basic knowledge and, math and different things. And partly, I think, to figure out what you like, what you're interested in, to explore. And like I think we've talked about it in the county with doing like job-specific training, like more trade, like type things, like at Monroe. Like if someone knows,
we need to quit building new high schools and
Right.
build more technical and vo-tech schools.
Yeah.
Because they're so over capacity that kids who should be going can't go. Like that actually, that sort of back to that question, but like that's one of the thing that I would do is instead we build a new high school every year, every 2 years because of population growth. We could really just drop in 2 more, academies or vo-tech schools. And when kids are going every other day to it, you lighten the population in all the schools that already exist and provide people opportunities to do things they're going to use that matter. Like my last interview with Esther Kim, she's an artist, and she talked about how she basically didn't have a portfolio for some of the things that she wanted to do. Like she has a portfolio coming out of high school, but it's this sort of general art portfolio. There's no reason that she couldn't build a portfolio for media arts and design, for graphic design, and just go get a job. There's no reason she shouldn't be able to do that, except that she wasn't provided any of the opportunities in school, and on top of school you get enough homework and the rest that you can't go get a job or get an internship that lets you build your portfolio. Like, we should do that. So all right, so
changing the education system. Whew. Started from the ground up.
just knock it all down.
Yeah, like say we talk about this question, like if you were to design cars today, knowing what you know, how would they look different? And I always think of this when I was in grad school, I had a professor who she worked with this orphanage in Sierra Leone. And she went over spring break, and when she came back and she was talking about it, and just at the end of class, I was like, can I go with you next time you go?
Oh, wow.
And so I didn't go with her, but I did go over that summer and taught at an orphanage in Sierra Leone. And besides being just like a completely switched perspective, because I was, a very tall white female I actually made a little boy cry because I was the first white person he'd ever seen.
What's wrong with her?
Seriously, like you think about that and you're like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
like I imagine how but they have no telephone wires because they went straight to cell phones.
Oh.
So it was like this completely, because some of the university students were taking us like on a tour of and like pointed it out, and you're just like, oh my gosh. And like their mail system, and so it's like if you design something now for where we're at, how different would it look?
If you quit evolving what you have and just start fresh.
Yeah.
Hey, this is, I don't know if you can use this at all for women's studies. This is something I got out of an anthropology class, but they talked about why things are the way they are and how this all sort of evolves and it's cultural. And they said, why is a car the width it is? And everybody goes, well, because it fits the width of the road. You go, okay, sure, so why is the road that width? And they're like, well, because that was the size of like Roman chariots and stuff in Europe, and they just brought it here. Like, okay, sure. Why was the chariot that wide? And they're like, and it's because in not all, but almost all cultures around the world, the quote-unquote normal traditional family unit is a male and a female together. That polygamy, while it exists, is historically, even, you have to go pretty far back before it's really common. And even in that setting, there's usually like a first wife or whatever. So the width of all these things are so that the 2 adults and the head of the family sit in the front of the carriage and kids go in the back. If we lived in societies where it was normal for 4 people to be married, you would be driving a car that's 4 people wide. All your roads would be wide. Like, and I was sitting, I'm like, that's not true. And then I'm looking up, I'm like, oh, damn, that's true, And so, and maybe that still fits that we have the two wide car kind of deal, but for school, we've built on top of a system that, really, even the way 500 years ago, school didn't look like school did 200 years ago, but school now looks a lot like it did 100, 150 years ago,
And so I think it would be kind of that reverse classroom, but reverse idea of the people implementing policies are often people that have never been in the classroom or haven't for a long time or aren't, like, starting to put teachers more in charge of that. Like, you know, we go to these PD sessions at the beginning of every school year, and it's this new acronym for the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, but you're still going to have the same issues. So what, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and it's with more push towards project-based learning and more, at least more consideration. I don't know if we're doing it yet, but more of a consideration for how do these skills, how's this knowledge translate to the rest of your life or to a job. Like, you almost flip it on its head and bring back the apprenticeship model. And so, like, go do the thing you're into, and then use, like you really, and I love science, I love history, but you really just need math and English. Like, you need to be able to read and write and speak, and you need to be able to do arithmetic well, preferably in your head. Like, advanced math is great, like, but you'll choose that in your job. Everybody should have an English and a math class. Why can't you spend the rest of your day in, like, an apprenticeship mode?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that would flip it around and let kids choose what they wanted to do.
I don't know if Broad Run does it yet, but we do the capstone.
Yeah, the internship at the end of senior year.
Yeah, and so many students, like, the feedback, and I tell them, I was like, when I came out of college as an undergrad, I thought I wanted to go into publishing and editing, and I did. I worked at a magazine, did not like it.
Yeah.
Like, I was like, oh my gosh, this is just stifling, this is boring. And so then, you know, I was lucky enough to be able to move back home for a little while, figure out what I wanted to do. So I said part of that, the capstoning experience, I wish it was a little longer for them, but you might not find the thing you love, but maybe you realize, okay, I can't sit behind a desk. I don't love this. Like, I don't like customer service. I don't want to interact with this.
Yeah, should you be paying $20,000, $30,000 a year at a university to figure out what you do or don't want to do? You know, like, we could do some of that. We could at least narrow your options a little bit, or help you to narrow your options before you make this big investment and all the rest. Where did you go to college?
University of Virginia.
Okay. Did you do grad school there?
No, I undergrad there in English, and then master's at Mason for education.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you grow up in Virginia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I went to Phyllis High School.
Okay, all right. Who was your principal?
Oh my gosh.
Oh no, I know my principal. I know Spage worked there for a while, but, like, I think that was probably after you were in high school.
Gosh, what was his name? That's really speaks highly of him. It'll come to me like
that's okay. No,
minutes,
I was just thinking, like, it's funny how, like.
Well, I always wonder because I had an AP Stats teacher, Mrs. Spage, and she was like would have been around that same age.
His ex-wife, I believe, is a teacher, but I think in Fairfax. I'm not sure. And he's remarried now. Who I believe his wife now is a teacher in the county, but I'm not sure what she teaches.
But a Spage came after I graduated.
Yeah. It's funny because I'm now old and crusty enough as a teacher that I have a handful of students who are now teachers.
Yes.
And it's weird because that, like, was a sudden shift where I'm like, oh man, I guess I've been doing this for a while. Mm-hmm. And then I started thinking, like, oh, they better be good. Yeah. Like, and there's one that I can think of, maybe two, who I actually taught for 2 years. Like, I caught them early in my career in 9th and then 11th grade, or then, like, 10th and 11th, and I'm like, man, if they suck, that's on me. Like, that's like, I know I've been doing this long, but
first year teaching, I taught all freshmen. In that class,
I think that's what they try to do. Yeah.
Try to do. Easy in. I don't know if that's always easing you.
We got 3 other years to clean up that mess. Yeah. That's what it is, I think.
They just graduated college that year, and I had coached volleyball, so I had some older volleyball players. But it is that thing when they come back and they're like teachers, professionals. I had a student call me who the way it worked out, had him as a freshman. Then I moved up to teach 11th grade. He had a different 10th grade teacher. I had 11 for him for 11th, and then 12th when I taught AP Lit. Yeah. And he called me this year in the spring to tell me he got engaged to another student he met in our AP Lang class.
Oh, that's awesome. Yes. That's funny.
And I was just like, I'm so happy. You're making me feel so old right now.
Yeah,
you're like an adult getting married.
It's weird. That's in the last episode of the podcast, Esther, I taught her in 11th and she TA'd in 12th. But I think it's her grade was the class that I caught on that transition from 9th to 11th. So there's a few kids, that she's friends with who like, now I meet up with her and a couple of these kids maybe once or twice a year. We just, they hit me up a couple of years ago and we had fun. And so now we just do that once in a while. You know, it's really cool. And it's actually one of the things that led me to the idea of the podcast is that a part of being a good teacher is treating your students like people. But that means that after they graduate, they're still people. It's not like you have to be friends and keep in contact, but like if you can easily forget that these people will still exist, like if all you think about when you think of like say that former student, if the only thing you think of is that thing the kid said in class or did in class, and you have this blind spot that person is still alive and doing things and they have a job, like there's no way we're doing this good in the long term. Like we're taking a very sort of myopic sort of view of what we're trying to do. So some of this is like what happens after school and like is this stuff working out? But when you catch those classes, and I had one at Broad Run too where at first they gave me 10th and 11th knowing that I won 11th. So I had a class where I taught some kids in 10th grade and then in 11th grade, and then 2 or 3 of them TA'd for me in 12th grade. And I'm not necessarily in close contact, but you know, here and there shoot a message and it's like, man, like you guys better be awesome because like I feel more responsible here than probably more than I should, to be honest.
Oh,
like like you're now responsible for a marriage.
Yeah. I know. Oh my gosh.
I hope that works out, you know.
But it is those students. But coming back to the thing you said, treating them as people, I would say, you know, that's part of it. Someone said it, I want to say one of my first years teaching was when you get asked what you teach, you don't teach English, you teach students.
Right.
And how am I going to convey this subject to the students I have in my classroom? Yeah. And, you know, that's always my thing is I'm going to set the bar up here. I'm going to treat you like people that know and have opinions and thoughts. And you find that they're finally like, yes, I do, and someone's willing to listen to me and not write me off just because I'm a teenager or a kid.
That's like I said with the philosophy stuff, like it goes so well in the academic classes because you have some really capable kids who are taking APs and other subjects and just English isn't their thing, or they don't do their homework, so they're taking, you know, and it should still be a good and challenging class, and maybe sometimes it isn't. And so when they get the opportunity to think hard about something, and the idea that like their input matters, and they get really excited about it, and that's why I think the academic classes get more excited. I mean, the AP kids are into those discussions, but the academic classes, like I literally this year, like we had kids like not angrily, violently, but kids literally standing up and like yelling across the room. I had a kid just walk up to the board 2 different times, same kid 2 different times, just walked up and was like, "That's it," grabbed a marker and starts drawing a diagram on the board like uninvited. I'm like, "What's going on?" I asked him later. I was like, "What's that about?" He goes, I don't know, just no one's thinking about this right. And then I thought about it, and no one's ever asking me to do any thinking, and so I have the answer. And I was like, yes.
Yeah.
You know, but you're a person, you know. Like when I started teaching, when I came out of college, I was like, I don't know, I guess I'll teach. I don't, you know, kind of wanted to write, but it's hard to get a good writing job, or, you know, at least one that pays. So, all right, I'll teach. I really like English. And I was probably within the first 2 years realized that if you don't like the kids more than the content, you're not going to do this well at this level anyway. Maybe in college you can get away with content first. I don't think you can be a good high school teacher if you don't like the people more than your content. You know, and I don't know, maybe I might be wrong, but I know that was a big change for me in the first couple of years and probably made me a better teacher was when I realized that, you know, hey, my love of transcendentalism is great, and I can convey some of that, but if I'm here just to talk about civil disobedience and not really the people in the room and how this matters to you, like, I'm going to suck at this, like, badly.
And I think that helps so much because the kids can tell. And they can tell when you care about them, when you have a vested interest in them. So then they trust you and they're more willing to like, oh, all right, civil disobedience. Okay, Miss Berg, I'll read this for you.
Yeah, sometimes they'll play along just for
to appease you, and so you kind of build that rapport and that relationship and that trust. Like, I know this is going to be tough, but we're going to talk through it and discuss it and how we can apply it. And because you've shown that you respect them and their ideas and their thoughts.
Yeah, it's like we underestimate like the power of ethos sometimes. Yeah. It's just like because I'm in front of the room and I'm wearing a tie. You know, I haven't worn a tie since probably my 4th year teaching. Like that just does.
No.
Weddings, funerals, job interviews. Like that's it. I'm done. I have a whole rack of ties. What? Because as a young teacher, you have to somehow present yourself, and then you realize like I just need them to trust me.
Yes.
And so I spend a lot of time, like especially in AP, where I don't try to do a ton of exam practice. I mean, we do a lot of timed writes, but I hold most multiple choice until the second half of the year. And then a month before the exam, we do a bunch of it. Everyone hates it. And they're like, why didn't we spread it out? And I go, one, I'm always trying to. Two, it doesn't work because I think it's less important than the discussions that you guys liked. And three, all the stuff we've been doing, I keep telling them, like, trust me. It's in there. And they're like, how is this going to help in the exam? Just trust me. It's going to be there. And sometimes that's a bad answer. Sometimes I'm just being lazy and like I have to be careful. But like sometimes it's just trust me. And if they do trust you, they play along and the exam goes fine, and they don't have to worry about it. But so you didn't go to school originally to be a teacher. Mm-hmm. Do you think that your education has like supported you, or like is it, I don't want to say like is it worth it, because like we're in a job where obviously you're using what you did in school, but like do you feel like your high school and college experiences were valuable? Like the things you would want to change in it, do you wish you could go back and redo school again in a different, like, you see what I'm saying? Going through whatever system we both say grew up in and going into these schools, has that served you?
I would say college, yes. High school, I think like everyone's had those experiences where you have those teachers that you remember, and be it a particular lesson, relationship, philosophy on life, whatever they imparted with you. But those were the few and far between moments. One, I'll give an example, and I still keep in touch with her today, was my volleyball coach, and I had her for 10th grade health and PE, Linda Lacey Helms. She taught me more about discipline and hard work and what you can achieve in doing this stuff than anything else. And that wasn't like a classroom lesson. I
think that's probably true for a lot of people, though. Like some of the most valuable stuff I got in high school, my high school, I'm from Pennsylvania, but we did a huge spring musical, 4 days, but like my junior year we did Wizard of Oz. I was on the production team, basically. Like we did the finance and made the programs. We sold all the advertising. We raised almost $45,000 for a 4-day show. We had like pyrotechnics and flying monkeys and witches and like the whole thing. I learned more in how to make a professional phone call, how to answer an email, how to use Excel and Access, and like so many things that I never would have done in the classroom. And then I think as the teacher, you say, how would I change school? And I go, do that. But it's like you can't force everyone into it. I chose to do that. And doing project-based stuff in the classroom might be a good idea, and it's a little step towards it. It's still not authentic. You're still creating, this sort of thing. And so the stuff that you might learn in athletics from your coach or in another extracurricular, I probably learned as much, about patience and the rest from like playing golf in high school than like I didn't get any of that in class. That's tricky. So you say like you think college served you well, but high school, like only selectively. It's almost like the stuff that served you in high school was incidental to the rest of high school.
Right. And it's interesting too, and I'm just like thinking about Linda, and I'm thinking about what my students say about me. Like I do a similar evaluation things, and just through letters, conversations, year or two after they graduate, getting back in touch, like they don't remember my lesson on rhetorical analysis, or even in women's studies, like that specific person and date I've taught them. A lot of them say it's what I taught them by showing them who I am as a person, and that like my thing too, I think with students is like they can sniff out a hypocrite like that, do as I say, not as I do. And
that's the one redeeming value of Catcher in the Rye.
Phonies.
Is knowing the phonies when you see them. That's the one,
And that's what I've come to see a lot of students say about me is like, I'm not going to tell you or a philosophy or life or thing I fight for that I don't do in my own personal life, And so I think they kind of see that. And that was the same with like Linda, learning that, you know, you be who you are and you're vested in the value in that, in your students, your players, your whomever will see that. And so and I think in college, just with the age and you get to know a little more of yourself, and some students ask me, you know, when did you become a feminist? And it's like, well, I start to look back, and I think that's one of the things of teaching high school. You kind of always self-reflect, or at least I do. I'm like, what was I like at this age? I'm just trying to remember back, like, and you're like, ooh, some things are cringeworthy, and some are like. And the more I've been self-reflected, and like my mom will say, like, you've always been this way.
Yeah.
I just didn't have the word or the term, because I always tell them this story about when I was in a history class with a particular teacher who I tended to butt heads with, and I was a good student, you know, very respectful of my teachers, but this one, and I called him sexist, and he like pushed a desk into me, and it, you know, and it was one of those ones where my mom was like, she would always let me fight my own battles, like, but I was like, no, you know, he was wrong in what he was saying, and I look back on that and I was like, I'm still right, like and now I have the word and the idea and the notion for it. And so I think why I say college is because I started taking the women's studies courses, and then I was an English major.
Right.
Through the English classes I was taking, I was exposed to the broader range of books and literature and writers that I wasn't in high school. So where I loved reading, I was not assigned The Handmaid's Tale or The Belle Noire or the things that really...
You're also in a setting where it's okay for them to make it hard. Like in high school, not that people aren't making it hard. And I think we, in certain ways, should make it harder, not by amount of work, but by you don't have to do more stuff. You just have to do the same stuff better. And I don't know that we, as a profession or whatever, I don't know that we always judge that well. But in college, I don't think professors necessarily worry as much about it. And so you take a class that sounds interesting, and then they make it hard. And if you're actually interested, you rise to the occasion. But you get all of this exposure to things that wouldn't have worked in a more diverse room where people didn't choose to be there or whatever. You know, hey, you chose this class, and you're going to read this stuff. And then in the end, you're like, oh, I'm into it. And then you do the reading. And that's where, if you're academically inclined, college is awesome.
Yes.
You know.
And back to kind of what we were saying, I think part of it, that freedom. So I tell my students this, for instance, and sometimes this is one of those taboo things to talk about in class, but a lot of it comes up with women's studies in particular, like religion. So as an English major, I ended up, just through the amount of courses I took, minoring in religion, and I am not religious.
Okay,
I'm an atheist, and I tell my students that, I'm like, if we're going to talk about it, I'll be honest. And so my first year, for requirements for UVA, we had to take a non-Western religion course. Right. And so I just picked one that fit my schedule. I'm not really a morning person in the afternoon. And so it was Islamic mysticism. Ooh. And so I go in the first day and realize, the number was like a 400 level class. Like, this is for grad students. No. And the Professor Sachedina, I'll always remember him, he starts writing in Arabic on the board, and I'm like,
yeah.
So I get a withdrawal
form. Guess I'm going to stop by the registrar
yes.
after this one.
And I came back to him the next meeting of the class, and I was like, Professor Sachedina, blah, blah, blah. And so because it was a grad school or a grad level class, a higher level class, it wasn't a big one. It's like 20, 25 students. He sat down with me and he talked to me, and he was like, well, what are you interested in? What is this? And I told him, English and women. And I was like, well, just bring that to this.
Yeah.
And so I ended up writing my research paper on this female prophet and this, and finding that way into this course through my perspective and my avenue. Yeah. Right. And I stayed in the class. I loved it. Yeah. It completely, broadened my perspective of things. And so I think if we did that more earlier, find your own way into this core idea I'm teaching you about.
It's, do it yourself and enjoy it, but don't forget that this is compulsory.
Yeah.
That's the double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. All right, so we need to start winding this up, because about 10 minutes ago, I looked at the clock and realized that we've been doing this for a while. And so there's probably a million other things we could talk about. But there's one question I definitely want to ask, and then before they kick us out of here, if there's anything else you want to plug or rant about. But one of the questions is there a book or a movie, it can be a couple, and as an English teacher this is tricky, but whether it's for classroom or professional use or just something that you really like what's something that you think more people should read or watch for whatever reason?
Okay.
And you're an English teacher, so it has to be a short list.
Yes, I know, like the book thing.
Yeah,
well, I finally got a chance to.
I would like to list 50.
Okay. Well, so I will answer the book one, because students always ask, as English teacher, what's your favorite book? And I said, well, I don't have a favorite because I can't. Yeah. I have ones that have impacted me the most in my life and way of thinking, and I would say The Handmaid's Tale. Okay. Absolutely. And it's now a series on Hulu, and so I finally got the chance this summer, because, 2 young kids, and it's now in season 3, but to sit down and watch it. And it's a book by Margaret Atwood, a dystopian setting, and she calls it speculative fiction. And I taught this in AP Lit, and I always, suggest it to students, because everything in the book that happens to the women has happened to women at some point in the history of human civilization. She just brings them all together into what she calls the inevitable conclusion, if this was actually carried out. And so I read it every couple of years, and when I was teaching it, and finally watching the first season follows the plot of the book, it was horrifying on an entirely different level because of where we are right now in this country.
Right. Does I own, I want to say 2 or 3 copies of the book. I have read no more than excerpts when I was in college. I actually also own the Audible book, which I someday will listen to, But that's one where, the parts that I read I thought were great, but it was never assigned, and it was never one I found my way into. Do you think that the show does justice to the book?
Yes. There are definitely things that are different, and it was interesting. I always go on and read critics and what they're thinking about the show, after I watched it. And some things they changed, especially about race, because in her book, people of color are sent off to what these colonies are, because it's this whole religious kind of separation thing. Mm-hmm. And they don't do that in the show. They have more diverse characters, which is great, that representation. And they said, why are we going to carry out that racist idea, which was purposeful in the book, and make it a racist show and not showing that diversity? But it does hold, obviously, like any book to movie, television show, there's differences. But the first season is the book. And I think, like I always tell students, you might read the same book twice, you're never the same person reading it twice. And so watching it, my husband always said, he was like, you're never in a good mood after you watch that show. And I realized this is the first time I've come back into context in this world, in this Gilead, and since I've had daughters.
Okay.
And not that it wasn't hard before, there are parts where I was crying, because this one part where the daughter is taken from her, and and I was reading this critique, and commenters were discussing, and I don't know if anyone's listening, and I don't want to give spoilers away, but Offred ends up having a second daughter, and she has a chance to escape with her, but she stays for her first daughter who's been taken away, and some.
Oh, and now you're so it's the book doesn't change, but the reader did, and now
and because some people were commenting she should have gone when she had the chance and fight from the outside, and now as a mother I'm like,
but now you have a personal connection that changes.
I would never leave that. She got the one daughter out, she thinks she's safe in all intents and purposes, albeit not with her, she's in a better situation, versus the daughters that's and it's no, I would exactly make that same choice that she did. But yes, that's absolutely one. And Margaret Atwood wrote a sequel to it, The Testimonies, that's coming out soon. But I would highly recommend that. And then one, I have constantly wanted to show in class both AP Lang and women's studies. And so this is back to the if I could change one thing, they need to unblock YouTube and let us have access to Netflix.
Right.
Because, oh my goodness, there are so many great Netflix originals and
right.
documentaries that they don't sell them on hard copies. 13th by
Yeah, I used that in class the year before they blocked Netflix.
Oh my goodness. And I haven't watched her one When They See Us.
I haven't watched it yet. Yeah,
because I've heard it's pretty
yeah. That's when I actually started it, and then I realized it's a little later at night. My wife probably isn't going to love this as much as I am, and so do I really want to do this right now? And so I've held off on it. But yeah, 13th is fantastic.
Yes.
A nice substitution, because I do in AP especially, I do a little mass incarceration war on drugs unit, and then the kids do their own synthesis, and they take whatever you want. Kids and they're talking about education and healthcare. It just has to link back to the idea that too many people are in jail for a variety of reasons, and figure out what you want to do with it. And so I actually show the movie The House I Live In by Eugene Jarecki, who I really like. I actually also use an older documentary of his called Why We Fight. So if we do America at War or a war novel, that one's great because it looks at getting into Iraq and Afghanistan and how the military-industrial complex, how so much of this is profit-driven in ways we don't see. But it's more recent. It's older than 13th. I don't know. I want to say it's 2010 maybe, 2012. But it's called The House I Live In. And it starts with this sort of personal narrative of he has this nanny who helped raise him, was a black woman, but how she spent all this time with him. And so her kids, whatever, and then the problems they had with drugs and being arrested. And then he does this whole thing about it. And so it doesn't go quite as hard on the 13th Amendment and the slavery race issue, but it's a nice substitution, if you want to do it. 13th was awesome. So what I do now is I show the one in class because I can have the DVD and do whatever, and then I offer I try not to do much extra credit, but that's one where I'll offer kids a few extra points if you just go watch it. Meet up with some friends, watch the thing, give me half page, 3/4 page response, say something specific enough that I believe you actually watched it. That's it. They said, what are we going to do with it? That's it.
Just watch it.
You're going to love it. It's great awareness. And what you bring from it, you're still going to use in class. I tell them, if I could show you, I would.
Well, this is just funny side story. Knock Down the House on Netflix now, where they followed, it just came out, I'm going to say April, May. They were following 4 candidates leading up to the 2018 midterms, and one was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Okay.
And they had, you're watching this footage, they had no idea she was going to win.
Right.
So they kind of caught this lightning in a bottle. And so I watched it at night before school the next day, and I was crying, and it was just such this moment, emotion, and everything. I'd been talking about women's studies. So I came in the next day, and I was like, listen, I'm going to go to the restroom. I know you all have VPNs, which I don't know what that means,
right,
and hotspots. If you can figure out how to log in and get this up here, we're going to watch this.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So I come back, it's up, it's ready to go. And so
great problem solvers.
Right, a little workaround. Well, but that's the thing, they block it. And I'm like, the kids are all getting
around
it.
What's it called?
Knock Down the House.
Knock Down the House.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was just, because I think my whole thing with AP Lang and women's studies is you have a voice.
Yeah.
I don't care what you care about something and fight for it. Read and write and critical, like you said, and because I always do The Perils of Indifference by Elie Wiesel. It's one of my favorite speeches. And so I think that was just such a moment, and a moment they had lived through.
Right, it's recent enough that it's still
history.
Cool.
So that's a really good one too.
Nice.
Really
Awesome.
good one.
All right. So all right, we're gonna get kicked out of here in a couple minutes. But is there, we covered a lot of stuff. Is there anything that you had hoped we had talked about we didn't, or do you want to promote a thing or plug you have a free platform?
A free platform. I will promote. So I mentioned the summit I held last March, Women's History Month, and I'm doing it again, March 21st at Rockridge, and it's based on this whole idea of you can't be what you can't see. So
that's cool.
My idea with it was, we've been talking and reading about these women. Let me show you. Congresswoman Wexton was our keynote speaker. we had this panel of women in politics and different organizations. So we're going to do that again this year. And with that, my working theme, I haven't solidified all the details, is like essentially knowledge is power.
Yeah.
Like, know your 9, being your Title 9, know your rights, know your worth.
That's awesome. You know what? And that's funny, the way you said, you can't be what you can't see. I always say, when people say knowledge is power, I mean this completely non-offensively, but I would say that's a lie, because knowledge on its own does nothing. Knowledge creates options, and options are power.
Yeah.
When you can make choices and do the things that you choose, that's power. But if you don't know anything, you don't know what your options are. Like, if you can't see it, you can't be it, And so that's that's going to be like the theme that you're working around.
Yeah.
And this is open, like, is after school?
It's on a Saturday.
Okay.
So it's open to everyone, and coincidentally, the delegates we host from the international community, including some girls from the school I went to in South Africa, are going to be there. So I'm going to have kind of a think global, act local kind of premise in those conversations. But yes, it'll be, as we approach it, there'll be advertising and stuff like that. Yeah. But yes, open to everyone.
All right, and the name again?
Rise 2 Summit.
Rise 2. All right.
T-O, yeah.
So whenever you got like a website or whatever, like send me stuff and I'll post it.
Yes. Yep.
Because I am all about shameless self-promotion. So if I can promote something other than self, I'll feel even better about it.
Yeah. And that's where we're going to host the symposium for all the women's studies. So yeah, I think it's going to be pretty good.
All right, great. I really appreciate you doing this.
Oh, of course. Thank you.
Yeah. So hopefully this turns out okay. And, if people like it, we'll do it again sometime.
Yeah.
And promote more of your stuff, since, as it turns out, you're more motivated than me. So that's good. But awesome. All right.
No, thank you so much.
Yep, thank you.